It can be very useful when you're approaching a work like Rousseau's Discourse on the Origins of Inequality among Human Beings to take kind of a big picture overview of it before concentrating on each of the parts. And what I want to do here goes beyond just talking about key ideas or genre or historical context as I did in the previous video. What I want to do here is give you what we might call the master argument of Rousseau's Discourse. Tell you where it's beginning, where it's ending up, what he wants to get you, the reader, to consider, to accept, to buy into by the end. And it's quite a fascinating and enigmatic work. Oftentimes students, when they're approaching it, and I myself did this the first couple times that I read it, you're asking yourself, what is actually going on here? Is this supposed to be history or anthropology or political philosophy or pure speculation? I'm not quite sure about what he's trying to do or the points that he's trying to make. He's hard to pin down. It's very clear what he's criticizing. It's not always quite as clear what he is arguing for. And so what I want to do is give you the panorama picture of what's going on. You notice that we're going to talk about three main, we could call them states or conditions. When we talk about the human condition, Rousseau is somebody who is willing to say there is something that we can call the general human condition, because we're all really at bottom the same kind of animals. But whether we're in civilization or what type of civilization or degree of civilization we're in, plays an incredibly important role for him in the condition that we live in. So we have what he calls the original state of human beings, and then there's some transitions that are happening, and he's concerned to try to show us how these transitions might have taken place, in part by talking about human nature and what had to happen in order for human nature to go in this way and to develop and to be realized. And then we reach what we can call a state of savagery, a state that Rousseau thought corresponded to many of the indigenous peoples that the Europeans were encountering. Rousseau didn't have any first-hand experience with this. He's relying on reports from travelers and from people who are colonists or explorers living among the Native Americans in the, what's now the Americas, or peoples in far off other places that are rather exotic. But he can also think of this in terms of some of the historical developments that we're aware of, these great tribal peoples that eventually become nations that become more and more civilized. And finally, we have a state of civilization, which is an ongoing process. It's possible to become more and more and more civilized. It's not like you snap your fingers and now you're in civilization. It's a gradual, continuing process. And in many respects, this is a story of decline and fall from our original, pretty happy human condition in the state of nature, where we, although we were happy, we didn't really realize that we were happy or why we were happy or anything like that, because we hadn't developed much. We're still in the realm of the animals, just slightly different in some very important respects from the other animals. From there, we develop more and more techniques, more and more technologies, more and more things that gradually transform not only our environment, not only produce a society, but transform the human being, create new possibilities for them, to feel different passions, for example. We'll talk about that in a moment. And things become more and more complicated, and they get worse and worse and worse, according to Rousseau in the process. So for Rousseau, the ongoing progress of civilization is not actually a progress towards greater and greater and greater good, the way that many other people in his own time saw it. He's going to say it's a mixed blessing. Now, why is he writing this in the first place? It's about inequality. It's a discourse on the origins of inequality, but it's not just about origins, it's also about inequality in the present. And if we think about what is inequality, we're going to spend an entire video just talking about his discussions of the development of various modes of inequality. But what is it to be unequal? Rousseau makes a distinction, a very important distinction early on, where he talks about physical inequality. I am, 6'3". I'm not in particularly good shape, so probably most of the people watching this video, I'm bigger than you. I weigh more than you. I may even be stronger than quite a few of you, because although I haven't, been an athlete for more than a decade, I was at one time, and I still retain some of that with me. But that's a physical inequality. We can also talk about other people being bigger than me, or smaller than me, or stronger than me, or faster than me. We can make all sorts of comparative things along those lines. And I could contrast myself against my pets. I'm much bigger than my cat. I'm stronger than my cat. Although my cat, pound for pound, is a hell of a lot stronger than I am. Although I don't sleep 16 hours a day. Some of that strength comes from having the kind of muscles that can do short bursts of activity. But you see, we're talking about physical inequality there. That's not the sort of inequality that Rousseau is really interested in. Because physical inequalities can be, and have been, largely overcome, for human beings at least, by the use of technology and by the development of culture. So what kind of inequality are we concerned with? In our own situation now, inequality is a big buzzword, both in politics and in economics. And a lot of people tend to think about inequality just in terms of wealth, in terms of how much money you have, so your current possessions, your current wealth, your current ownership, or in terms of income, how much can you make? Other people will think about it in terms of opportunities. Do you have the opportunity to go to a good college? Or, are you restricted from going to the more selective colleges? If it's just a matter of your SAT scores, there's probably not a great case anymore for saying, well, you're being dealt with in an unfair, arbitrary way, although some people still make those sort of cases. But if somebody is excluding you in our society on the basis of your gender, or your race, or veteran status, or religion, we tend to see those sort of inequalities as ones that we're very concerned with, and we think matter quite a bit. Now, in Rousseau's European society, the inequalities between rich and poor were much more glaring even than they are currently today. And that plays a role, but there's also, when we talk about rich and poor, and we talk about upper class and lower class and middle class, we're talking about something like a system of layering strata, and these strata correspond to prestige. They correspond to the assumed value of a person. It does have to do with opportunities as well, but much of it depends on who you get to associate with, where you get to go, what people will assume about you. If language is something we're going to talk about. Language can give away social class. If I speak in a northern Wisconsin accent as opposed to the southeastern Wisconsin accent that I have right here, which, by the way, as far as linguistics go, is pretty much the same accent as they have here in the Hudson Valley in New York, except for all the, people from the city who came up who still have New York accents. I'm going to be perceived in different ways. The vocabulary that I choose will do that as well. Now, these are all kinds of inequality that can make a big difference. Workplace, he's going to talk quite a bit about slavery and about occupations. We might think in terms of our workplace. I, for example, am an adjunct. I'm not going to get into a lot of adjunct issues, but adjuncts are treated pretty shabbily compared to full-time professors in most institutions. There's a whole literature out there that we could go into. I've been fortunate to have avoided quite a bit of that, but I know many people who are in terrible conditions of inequality, and that's part of why adjuncts are currently unionizing. There's a contemporary example. So when we're thinking about inequality, whether we're in the 18th century like Rousseau was, or whether we are in the 21st century like we are today, and whether we're thinking about it in global terms or in terms of one particular society, we can ask ourselves certain questions that this discourse is meant to try to answer. The one that Rousseau is going to focus on the most is, how did we actually get here? He is going to try to tell us a story. He's going to try to reconstruct an account. And the story that he's telling, by the way, is one that is supposed to be better than the stories that other people have been telling about this sort of thing and about human origins. The 18th century and the 17th century before it had quite a few theorists who were talking about the state of nature, talking about the origin of property, the origin of laws, the origin of civil society. Thomas Hobbes is a great example. Pufendorf, who he talks about. Locke, Locke is somebody very important for the American context as well. They all had theories of the state of nature, and they would eventually talk about things like a social contract or, moving towards civil society. Now, Rousseau wants to look at this picture very carefully, and he's going to place a much greater stress on certain key developments that are going to take place. And those key developments help to answer the question, how did we get here? So agriculture and metallurgy are part of the answer to that, or the development of law and government, another key component to that. The development of language, that's something central as well. So when we ask this sort of question, how did we get here, and we provide some sort of narrative or story that is supposed to answer that question and provide us with a coherent progression from one thing to the next, to the next, to the next, here we get into what's really interesting about Rousseau's position. When we're asking about present-day inequality, or about the inequalities that are taking place along the way, one of the things that we can ask about is whether it's got a necessary basis, whether things have to be this way. And if we're doing this kind of comparative work, where we talk about, an original state, and then a state of savagery, of uncivilized human beings, and then we talk about a state of civilization that produces a lot more goods and a lot of variety of things, but also a lot of misery. We can say, well, it's not actually necessary that human beings be at this point, because they were at this point before, they were still human beings then, and they could even be back there. So that's one sense of it. We can also tell ourselves, in Rousseau's view, that these great developments that happened along the way, they were not actually necessary, they were contingent. And so this provides what we would call a genealogical account, where we're tracing things back to origins, the genesis of things, and we're showing how where things currently are in the present is a product of fortuitous or not deliberate, not well planned out, but to some degree contingent and arbitrary processes that have taken place. And to say that some of them are contingent, think about language, for example. It may not be contingent that human beings developed language. Perhaps there's something about the nature of human beings that did involve us gradually developing linguistic capacities and actually developing human languages. And the English is a great example for this, how we actually spell things in the English language, totally contingent, totally a matter of an entire history that, unless you study the language, you're not going to know very much about. You'll just be puzzled about, where, and where, or there, and there, or why it's swim, swam. That doesn't seem to make any sense. But if you know the history of it, if you know the genealogy of it, you say, oh, well, swam is the preterite. And Germanic languages have a preterite, and they involve umlauting, vowel change. Now see, once you do that sort of thing, you can understand how things got to where they are, but you realize that although there seems to be something like a kind of necessity operating there, they didn't really have to be that way. They may be the product of cause and effect that happen, but it's not some sort of absolutely necessary in the nature of the universe sort of thing that dictates that English spelling, or actually French spelling for that matter too, is so bizarre and archaic and difficult and creates all sorts of problems for foreigners who are trying to learn English, right? So that's another thing too. Does it have a necessary basis? We're going to explore that. And then here's another key question. What should we do? Here we're asking the question of, what is Rousseau actually trying to get at here? Is he saying that civilization is bad and we should try to escape from civilization and maybe go off to the South Sea Islands and, like an artist and just sort of live a savage life? Or perhaps even try to get back to this original state of nature? Is that a possibility for us? Or are we screwed? Are we just stuck with civilization with all of its problems, and perhaps we can try to ameliorate certain things in certain ways, reduce some of the inequalities, but perhaps we're doomed? What is he actually saying? Now, I do have a good answer to that last one available for you. He talks at a certain point, and this is in the first part of the discourse. He says, "It's easy to see that many of the differences which distinguish men are merely the effect of habit and the different methods of life men adopt in society. A robust or delicate constitution and the strength or weakness attaching to it are more frequently the effects of a hardy or effeminate method of education than of the original endowment of the body. It's the same with the powers of the mind," he continues, "for education not only makes a difference between such as are cultured and such as are not, but even increases the differences which exist among the former, in proportion to their respective degrees of culture, as the distance between a giant and a dwarf on the same road increases with every step that they take." So what Rousseau is saying here is that we do, as human beings, have some capacity to determine in civilization, in the vantage point that he's writing from, whether we want to suffer all of the problems and all that inequalities that come with civilization, the miseries of civilized life, or whether we want to try to return, at least in part, to something that would be less bound by the laws, less in fear of the state and the government, less obsessed with comparison and with wealth getting and all these sorts of things. That's why Rousseau not only is an Enlightenment figure, but also a romantic figure, one of these sort of, in many respects, back to nature kind of types. So, all of that said, let's now turn to this diagram that I put up here. Since I drew it, we may as well use it, right? You notice, like I said, we have the original state of human beings, a state of savagery, and finally succeeding that, a state of civilization. And what we're talking about here are quite literally thousands of generations of human beings. So we're not talking about an individual jumping from one to the next, although you could take a person who's in a state of savagery and perhaps try to, make them miserable by putting them in civilization, Rousseau would say. He'd actually say, those tribal people, those indigenous peoples, leave them the hell alone. They're doing okay already. You don't need to make them worse off by introducing all this sort of stuff. Now, what we're looking at here is a progress. You notice I've got these arrows, and certain things are going to happen, and these things are also going to be the product of many generations. They are not something that happens all at once, like language, just suddenly pops into everybody's head. And here is where Rousseau is actually saying that a lot of his predecessors have got things wrong. They're taking people that they assume to be like this, and they're, with all of their capacities, all the things that took human beings thousands of years to develop, and they're projecting them back into an original state of human nature and saying that's what it must have been like for human beings. So Thomas Hobbes, for example, comes in for a lot of criticism as having taken the human beings as we know them in our society, about 150 odd years before maybe a little bit less before Rousseau, and having projected them into a state without society. We see things sort of like this when we have fantasy or science fiction novels or TV shows where we throw a bunch of people onto a desert island and there's no society and they have to decide what they're going to do. We actually, had a whole show that was quite popular for a while where they kind of did that, called Survivor. And Rousseau is saying, no, in the original state, human beings are just like one step up from the other animals. As a matter of fact, the only ways that human beings, other than the way their body is designed, are fundamentally differing from the other animals, are in the possession of two different but interconnected faculties that are going to be absolutely determinative for them. He says animals think. Animals and human beings are not radically distinct on that basis. They think, we think. As a matter of fact, some of us may think less than certain animals. There's not a huge difference. How we differ is that we have free will. Animals are stuck with their basic set of instincts, which are quite malleable. So consider a dog, for example. Dogs in their natural environment are pack creatures. They know how to find food. They know how to copulate and make new doggies. They know how to bark at things and chase them down and play with each other and bite each other and fight for dominance and all these sorts of things. But it's within a narrow range, and what the dog does is not the same thing as what the cat does or what the bear does. And we may ascribe the same sort of ideas to them. Well, the bears are fighting for dominance over territory or something like that. But it's really a whole different set of instincts. So each animal species is kind of like its own, world unto itself in a way. And they can't fundamentally change their own nature. So, a dog is not going to say, I need to be a vegetarian. It's not nice to eat meat. That'll never happen, nor is that going to happen, by the way, with a cat. Cats are even more vicious than dogs in that respect. That's part of what I love about cats. Human beings, on the other hand, have free will. So human beings can actually go against their instincts. They can say no, or they can decide, I'm going to do this, even though my instinct is telling me to go over here. And that can really screw us up. As a matter of fact, that's not a necessarily good thing, according to Rousseau. It's a way in which we manage to get ourselves into all sorts of difficulties that instinct might have gotten us out of. But it also opens up the door for human beings to be able to decide for themselves what it is that they are going to do and what it is over time that they are going to be, and what the people coming after them are going to have on the horizon to do and be as well. That brings us to the second key difference between human beings and animals, and that is what Rousseau calls the capacity or the faculty of self-improvement. We are able to actually work upon ourselves and make ourselves more than we are, more than we have been. And we have to do this of necessity, because the human animal, unlike most other animals, doesn't have all of what it needs from birth on. If you think about insects, for example, I remember, in the spring, I would watch praying mantises hatch, and you would see this entire flood of little tiny baby praying mantises that look exactly like adult praying mantises, except very small, just running and running and running across the earth. And why is there so many of them? Because most of them are going to get eaten by stuff, and then there'll be a few praying mantises left. But those little tiny baby praying mantises, they have all of the instincts of the adult praying mantis already hardwired into their brains. Same thing goes for spiders. I remember, in the spring seeing little baby brown recluses running all over the place in Indiana as well, because, they'd hatched. And same thing with house spiders. You can see that happening. Little spiders are just little spiders. A deer, about, an hour after it's born, or even a calf, a cow, a domesticated animal, it's ready to start walking around. It's not ready to start eating grass yet. It's going to nurse for a while, but it's not going to nurse for that long. The period of development for most animals, except, with certain things like, where there's larval stages and pupa and then finally adult stages, it tends to be pretty short. And even those animals that do have stages like that, a caterpillar starts out as an egg, and then it becomes a caterpillar, and it eats a lot of stuff, and it forms a cocoon or a pupa, and then it becomes a butterfly. It never actually, says, I'm not going to be a butterfly, the hell with that, I'm going to be a beetle instead, or I'm going to have armor plating, or I'm going to do that sort of thing. Human beings, we can, in fact, decide to make more of ourselves, and we have to, in part because of the kind of creatures that we are. We are infants for a while, who are totally helpless, totally vulnerable, totally up to the mercy of the environment and those who are tending to us. And then we become children, then we become adolescents, then we become adults, and half the time as adults we're still just big children screwing things up. And maybe by the time that we're 40, some of us 50, some of us 60, we've got things figured out. And we've worked upon ourselves a lot of times. So these two things make us different from the other animals. Those are what allow us to develop thought and language. Those also come out of having the passions. And at first, Rousseau thinks human beings are fundamentally, trying to respond to their emotions, their passions, their desires. But through that comes the development of thought and the development of language. And these two go hand in hand with each other, because you need thought in order to continue to develop language, especially if you want to have something like what we call grammar. Grammar is necessary in order for you to be able to understand what I'm saying, articulation. On the other hand, language is needed in order for thought to advance. And along with these comes the first beginnings of association of human beings through natural sympathy with each other. That provides the basis for that. And that grouping of human beings into families and for finding some sort of fixed residence, building shelters, staying under the same roof, produces the first property. It also begins to affect our passions as well. We begin to feel things that we didn't feel before, like, say, conjugal love or paternal affection, Rousseau says. All of this is going to lead us ultimately to a state of, he calls them savages or barbarians, but we could just think of, if you like the word primitive peoples or indigenous hunter-gatherers, pastoralists, people like that. That's what he has in mind. As we begin to become more settled, something else comes in, and that's very important, and that's this conception of morality. And that begins to replace this primitive natural sympathy that we have for others of our own kind, this fellow feeling. Instead, we begin to be concerned with comparison of ourselves with others and in our status and in not having our status violated by other people. When they do violate our status, if we can, we punish them as hard as we can to make sure that not only do they not do it and we get something back, but all those other jerks over there don't think about messing with my status. And in the state of savagery, morality begins to take control over the human heart rather than sympathy. Now, it's possible to stay in a state like that where you now have thought, you have language, you have property, you have morality. It's pretty easy to live, Human beings have figured out some basic technology. They're able to provide themselves with food. They have some leisure time, and they enjoy themselves quite a bit. And it's actually pretty healthy bodily as far as Rousseau is concerned. The second revolution, he says, the first revolution is that of property. The second revolution is of agriculture and metallurgy. Metallurgy might be thought of as, we could call it a technological revolution. Learning how to work metal vastly expands the human capacities to change their environment, to work upon the natural things that they encounter, to engage in agriculture, to better engage in hunting. It also raises the stakes for their killing each other as well. stone knives and stone bows and arrows and spears, not so much that you can do with them compared to, say, a bronze sword or a bronze axe. And human beings are now becoming a much more dominant force within the entire ecosphere, you could say. Along with this comes the development of different forms of wealth, more development of the passions, more capacity for comparing ourselves against other people, and eventually this leads us into the state of civilization. And civilization is an ongoing process. For Rousseau, one of the key things that happens with civilization is the introduction of law. And he talks about this as a trick that the rich play upon the poor. The rich want everybody treated equally, everybody protected by the law, but what that really means is the protection of the property of the rich. Society, what we're talking about there is a whole complex set of valuations of people against people compared to each other. The notion that people have, certain customs that they have to follow. You were born into this class, you should stay in that class, you should know your place. All of that is part of society as he's talking about it. And then finally, government. Government itself expands and expands and expands and covers more and more of human life. And eventually, what we have is an entire set of inequalities that didn't exist in these states back here, but do exist in the state of civilization. And these inequalities make for a pretty unhappy life, even for the rich, even for the powerful. So, Rousseau thinks that the civilized person is a sick person, that the really healthiest person is this one, or at least the people in these, indigenous, primitive, less civilized societies. That is the grand sweep of his argument. So he's not saying that civilization is, in fact, a good thing in and of itself. It does open up a lot of possibilities for us. This is something that should pose some really interesting questions for our thinking about how we use technology ourselves and where our civilization is going. If Rousseau were here in the present, he might have additional stages that he would have put here. But I think that his basic argument would still be the same. He would be asking us, how did we get here? Does any of this have a necessary basis? The answer turns out to be no. And then what should we or what can we do? Not only as individuals, which, as individuals, maybe we can, get ourselves back to the land or live in a commune or, become hunters and fishers or something like that. But what should we do or what can we do as a society? Those are the sort of questions that we're left with at the end of this.